The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Nora Calloway would later say was the cruelest part of it. Not the contents, not the name signed at the bottom in a hand she didn't recognize, but the fact that it came on a Tuesday, the most forgettable day of the week, folded inside a plain manila envelope with a Harlan County, Montana postmark and no return address. She almost threw it away. She was running late for her shift at the hardware store. Her boots were still damp from the morning's rain, and her kitchen table was already buried under 2 weeks of mail she hadn't had the heart to open since the funeral. But something made her stop. The way the envelope sat slightly sideways on top of the pile. The way her name was written in full. Nora Jean Calloway. Not just Nora. Not resident. As if whoever had written it had taken some care. As if it mattered that she specifically received it. She set her keys back on the counter. She sat down in the chair that used to be her mother's. She opened the envelope. Before we go any further into what that letter said and what it set in motion, I want to ask you something. If you're listening tonight from your kitchen, your living room, your back porch, drop a comment and tell me where you are. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that a story about a woman reading one unexpected letter is being heard from 10 different corners of the world all at once. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, back to Nora and that letter and what she did next. The letter was from a lawyer. His name was Gerald Hatch, of Hatch and Associates in Bozeman, and he wrote in the careful, measured language of a man who had delivered difficult news often enough to know that directness was a kindness. He wrote that Nora was the named beneficiary of one Elias Vance Duvall, formerly of the Broken Horn Ranch in Harlan County, Montana. He wrote that Elias Duvall had passed on the 14th of October, 3 weeks prior, at the age of 71. He wrote that the estate was not uncomplicated, that there were parties with competing interests, that her presence would be required in person before the matter could be settled. He wrote, and this was the sentence Nora read 3 times, that under the terms of the will, her claim to the property was contingent on a 30-day residency period, beginning the moment she set foot on the ranch. Nora Jean Calloway had never heard of Elias Vance Duvall in her life. She was 38 years old, 5'4", and had not left the state of Kansas in 11 years. She worked 30 hours a week at Pemberton's Hardware, where she was trusted to manage inventory and quietly ignored during staff meetings. She drove a 2009 Subaru with a cracked passenger mirror. She had buried her mother 9 weeks ago, and the grief was still fresh enough that she sometimes forgot about it for a few hours and then remembered all at once, like stepping off a curb she hadn't seen coming. She had $1,100 in her checking account, no credit card debt, and no particular reason to go to Montana. She read the letter a 4th time. Then she called Pemberton's and asked for 30 days off, and when Dale Pemberton said he couldn't guarantee her position when she came back, she said she understood, thanked him, and hung up. She was in the car by 7 the next morning. Nora drove because she needed the time. 13 hours with her hands on the wheel and the flat Kansas farmland slowly giving way to the higher, drier breath of the mountain west gave her something no plane ticket would have. The physical sense of moving towards something unknown, the prairie rolling underneath her like a question being slowly asked. She didn't know who Elias Duvall was. She didn't know why his lawyer had her name. She only knew that her mother had been dead for 9 weeks. Her apartment felt like a room someone had removed all the air from, and the letter had arrived on a Tuesday with her full name written like it mattered. That was enough. She reached Harlan County at dusk on the 2nd day, when the light came in low and sideways from the west and turned the Beartooth foothills a color that had no name in any language she knew. She found the turnoff for Broken Horn Road on the 2nd pass, a rusted mailbox, a cattle gate, a track of compacted dirt that ran south for nearly a mile before the ranch house materialized out of the scrub pine. It was not a grand house. It was a 2-story timber frame with a covered porch along the front, dark green shutters that needed painting, a barn to the east that was in better shape than anything else on the property. Smoke was coming from the chimney. She had not expected that. She pulled up slowly and got out of the car, and before she reached the porch steps, the front door opened. The man who came out was somewhere in his mid-40s, weathered the way ranch men get weathered. Not aged so much as sharpened, lines cut deep around his eyes and mouth, hands that looked like they'd been used seriously and often. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and an expression of such perfect stillness that for a moment Nora couldn't read it at all. "You're the woman from Kansas," he said. "I'm Nora Calloway," she said. "I know who you are." He didn't move off the porch. "I'm Cash Duvall. Elias was my father." The silence that followed was long enough that a pair of barn swallows cut through it overhead. "I didn't know him," Nora said. "I want you to know that. I received a letter from your father's lawyer, and I can't explain it. I never met your father." Cash Duvall looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set in a way that said he was holding something back, but his eyes, brown, level, without malice, said he had decided, at least for now, to let it go. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Was my sister's, before she married and moved to Billings. Lawyer says you've got 30 days. He paused. "I've got a ranch to run." He went back inside. After a moment, Nora picked up her bag and followed. The first week was war conducted in silence. Cash Duvall was not cruel. He was not unkind in any way she could have pointed to and named. He simply moved through the ranch as if she were not entirely present, speaking when necessary, answering direct questions with direct answers, and otherwise disappearing into the physical work of a working cattle operation before first light and not returning to the house until the day was spent. Nora, who had nothing to do and no role yet assigned, found herself doing the only thing she knew how to do in uncertain territory. She learned the inventory. She knew inventory. It was what she'd done for 11 years at Pemberton's, walking the aisles with a clipboard, noting what was low, what was misplaced, what had been ordered and not yet received, what had been received and not yet shelved. So she did it here. She walked every room of the house with a quiet eye and a notepad. She cataloged the tack room. She noted which fences needed mending, which gates had hinges that were wearing thin, which of the barn's roof panels had begun to lift. She noted that the books in the front room had been read, actually read, some of them twice from the look of the spine creases, and that the kitchen was organized by a logic she had to spend 20 minutes standing in the doorway to understand before it became obvious. Everything was arranged by frequency of use, not by category. Whoever had designed this kitchen had thought carefully about motion and efficiency. She asked Cash about it once, on the fourth morning, when they briefly occupied the kitchen at the same time. "Was that your father's system?" she said, gesturing at the shelves. He poured his coffee without looking up. "Mine." She nodded, wrote nothing down. "Learned something." On the sixth day, she drove to Hatch and Associates in Bozeman and sat across from Gerald Hatch, who was exactly as careful and measured in person as he had been in the letter. He explained the competing interests. Broken Horn Ranch consisted of 412 acres, a working cattle herd of 83 head, and various outbuildings valued in total at just under $1.2 million. There was a second claimant, a man named Boyd Renfrew, who ran the adjacent Renfrew Grazing Company and who had, for the past 6 years, been in an active land dispute with Elias Duvall over the water rights to Sable Creek, which ran along the eastern boundary of the Broken Horn property and which both operations needed for summer grazing. Renfrew, Hatch explained, had filed a challenge to the will on the grounds that the beneficiary designation was improper, that Nora Calloway, unknown to the Duvall family and unnamed in any prior document, could not have been the legitimate intended recipient of a property of this magnitude, and that the challenge would proceed unless Nora could demonstrate, within the 30-day residency window, some legitimate standing. "What does legitimate standing mean?" Nora asked. Hatch folded his hands. "It means you'll need to show that your connection to this estate has basis. I can tell you that Mr. Duvall was very specific in his instructions. He said you would understand when you arrived." "He was wrong," Nora said. "I don't understand anything." Hatch gave her a look that was not quite pity and not quite admiration. "Then I'd suggest you start looking." She drove back to the ranch in the failing afternoon light with the question sitting across her sternum like a stone. She had $940 left. She had no job to return to. She had a mother in the ground and a stranger's will with her name in it, and a man with careful eyes who ran his kitchen like a system and had not, in 6 days, once asked her why she was really there. On the 7th night, she found the box. It was in the closet of the room she was sleeping in, the sister's old room, pushed to the back behind a cedar chest and covered with a piece of oilcloth. A wooden box, pine, with a small brass clasp. Inside, a stack of letters tied with kitchen twine, and on top, face up, a photograph of a woman Nora had never seen before. She knew the woman's hands. She had watched those hands braid her hair by lamplight. She had held those hands in the last 3 days of her mother's life, in a hospital bed in Wichita, and felt them go still. The woman in the photograph was her mother. She was young, younger than Nora had ever known her to be, standing in front of a barn, smiling in a way Nora had not often seen. And beside her, his arm not quite around her but close enough to almost be around her, was a man whose face Nora did not know but whose shape, whose stillness, she recognized somehow from the inside out. She sat on the edge of the bed with the photograph in both hands for a very long time. Then she untied the letters. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I suspect some of you know something about finding the story of someone you loved after they were gone. A box in a closet, a bundle of letters, a photograph that rewrites everything you thought you knew. If you're feeling something right now, sitting with that, you're exactly the kind of person these stories are made for. And I want to ask you this. If Nora had put the box back in the closet and walked away, if she had decided that some things are better left unknown, would you have understood her? Think about that. Write it in the comments. I'll read them. Now, back to Nora, who did not walk away. The letters were her mother's. Written over the course of almost 2 years, addressed to Elias Duvall at the Broken Horn Ranch, Harlan County, Montana. The earliest was dated 39 years ago, when Ruth Calloway, Ruth Oakes, she'd been then, was 23 years old. The last was dated 8 months after Nora was born. They were not love letters. Or not only. They were the letters of 2 young people who had found each other briefly and honestly, and then been separated by the kind of circumstance that has no villain. Her family's illness, his father's demands, 600 miles and no money, and neither of them with the cruelty to make the other wait for something they couldn't promise. The letters were careful and tender and full of the specific language of people who knew how to say true things without saying the most dangerous one. Ruth wrote about the garden she was planting. Elias wrote about a fence line he was repairing. They did not say I love you directly in any letter that Nora could find. They didn't need to. The last letter, the one dated 8 months after Nora was born, was the shortest. Her mother had written one paragraph. She said she had named the baby Nora Jean, after her own grandmother. She said the baby was healthy and serious and had a way of watching things that made Ruth feel she was already memorizing the world. She said she thought Elias should know. She said she didn't expect anything. She said she hoped he was well. She signed it Ruth, and then below the signature, in smaller handwriting, she had added, "She has your stillness." Nora sat with that sentence until the lamp on the bedside table was the only light in the house. She went downstairs. Cash was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a grazing rotation chart. And when she came in, he looked up and saw her face and went very still in the way she now recognized. She set the photograph on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Your mother," he said. It wasn't a question. "And your father," she said. The kitchen held them both in a silence that was not comfortable but was honest, which was better. Cash reached out and touched the edge of the photograph, not picking it up, just touching it. His jaw worked once. "He kept the box," Cash said, finally. "I didn't know what was in it. He asked me to make sure it was still in that room before you arrived. I thought," he stopped. "You thought I was a scam," Nora said. "I thought you might be." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry." She sat down across from him. "I didn't know either. She never told me." He nodded slowly. "He never told me. But," he turned the grazing chart over, absently, the way a man moves something with his hands when he is working through something in his head. "He asked me, 2 weeks before he passed, if I'd ever noticed that the ranch ran short on certain kinds of things. Patience. And women who can look at a mess and see the order inside it." He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it the way someone says something that has been sitting in them a long time waiting to be said. I thought he was rambling. He wasn't. Nora looked at her mother's young face in the photograph, at the smile she hadn't seen often. "Strange," she said, almost to herself, "how the people you've already lost find ways to keep giving you things." Cash said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. Boyd Renfrew came to the ranch on the 12th day. He drove a white pickup truck that cost more than the Broken Horn's annual operating budget. And he came with a man Nora would later learn was a structural engineer, which told her everything about what kind of meeting this was going to be. Renfrew was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that comes from a lifetime of not being told no. He had the Sable Creek water rights challenge filed and moving. He had a county assessor who owed him a favor, and he had, Nora would find out later, been slowly buying up adjacent grazing rights for 6 years in preparation for the day Elias Duvall died and left no clear air. He had not expected Nora Calloway. He stood in the yard and looked at her with an expression she had seen on other faces in other rooms. The brief recalibration of a man who has been told a small woman with a quiet manner is now between him and something he wants. "Miss Calloway," he said warmly, "I hope you've been comfortable out here. It can be a lot to take on, a working operation this size, especially for someone coming in without experience. I want you to know I have no interest in making your situation more difficult." Nora had been running inventory in the barn when she heard the truck. She still had a clipboard. "What's the cubic feet per second on Sable Creek in a dry July?" she said. Renfrew blinked. "Excuse me. The creek. Your engineer," she nodded at the man behind him, "is presumably here to assess the water table for your planned expansion of the east pasture. I looked at the county hydrology reports last week. The creek runs at about 4.3 cubic feet per second in average precipitation years. In the drought years of 2021 and 2024, it dropped below 2. Your expanded herd can't survive on 2 in a dry summer, and neither can ours. So whatever you're planning to do with the water rights if you get them, it doesn't work. Not without capital improvements to the diversion system that would cost more than this property is worth as a straight purchase." Renfrew looked at her clipboard. "I manage inventory," she said. "I'm good at it." The engineer looked at Renfrew. Renfrew looked at Nora with an expression that had changed considerably from the one he'd arrived with. He was not a stupid man. That was the truth of it. He had built a serious operation from ordinary land, and the kind of thinking Nora had just laid out in 30 seconds was the kind of thinking he understood and, on some level, respected. But he also had a challenge filed and momentum behind it, and he did not yet know how to adjust his position without looking like he'd been outmaneuvered by a woman with a clipboard who'd arrived from Kansas 2 weeks ago. "The will challenge stands," he said, finally. "I know," Nora said. "That's your right." She went back to the barn. Cash had watched the exchange from the porch without moving. When Renfrew's truck turned back up the drive, Cash came down into the yard and stood beside her at the barn door. "He'll go back to his lawyer," Cash said. "Yes," she said. "The challenge won't stick. You've established standing." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. A pair of his cattle dogs came and leaned against his legs, and he put a hand on one without looking down, automatically, the way a man touches something he trusts. "You could have told him it didn't work to get more money out of him," Cash said. "Negotiated. Used what you knew to make him come to a number." "I know," she said again. He looked at her sidelong. "Why didn't you?" She considered the question honestly, the way the question deserved. "Because this ranch doesn't need his money. It needs its water." She turned back to the inventory sheet. "Those are different things." Cash said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You sound like him." She didn't know if he meant her father or a version of herself she hadn't quite met yet. She supposed it didn't matter. Both felt true. What none of them had anticipated, not Renfrew's lawyer, not Gerald Hatch, and certainly not Nora, was the ledger. Cash found it on the 16th day, in a drawer of Elias's desk that he'd cleared a dozen times, but somehow never fully emptied. It was a handwritten operations log going back 22 years, and buried in year 14 was a section Elias had marked in red ink, "Sable Creek Covenant," signed July 2004. A joint water management agreement between the Broken Horn Ranch and the then owner of the Renfrew land. Not Boyd Renfrew, but his father, Clement Renfrew, who had sold the grazing company to Boyd in 2009. The agreement stipulated shared, proportional usage tied to precipitation levels, with neither party permitted to expand their draw without the written consent of the other. Boyd Renfrew had expanded his draw in 2021. He had not asked. Nora took the ledger to Gerald Hatch. Hatch took it to a water rights attorney in Billings. The water rights attorney looked at it for approximately 4 minutes before picking up the phone to call the county clerk. The will challenge was withdrawn 11 days later. Renfrew's 2021 expansion permit was referred for review. The review was not going to go well for him, and everyone in Harlan County who knew Boyd Renfrew understood, without being told, that the era of his particular brand of slow expansion was over. He did not lose everything. He was not ruined. His operation survived, scaled back. He had to renegotiate with 3 other neighboring ranches whose patience he had been wearing thin for years, and those negotiations cost him in ways that mattered. What he lost was the assumption that the valley worked the way he'd arranged it. That assumption, once gone, did not come back. If you felt something in the last few minutes, if some part of that hit closer to home than you expected, that's exactly why we're here. Stories like this one, about women who knew what they were looking at and had the patience to wait until it mattered, those are the stories I want to keep bringing you. If this is the kind of company you want to keep on a Tuesday night or a Sunday morning, I'd love for you to hit that like button and subscribe. It tells me you want more of this, and it means the world every single time. On the morning of the 29th day, one day before the residency window closed, Nora went to the room that had been the sisters' and packed her bag. Not to leave, to make a decision with her hands, which was how she'd always understood her own choices best. Cash found her there. He stood in the doorway and looked at the bag on the bed and then at her, and said nothing for long enough that she understood it was her turn. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. If I stay," she stopped. "Tried again. The ranch needs someone who can manage operations. Inventory, scheduling, financial oversight. I can do those things. I've been doing them for 2 weeks, and you know I can. That's not the question." She looked at the photograph of her mother, which she'd set on the dresser. "The question is whether the person who does those things needs to be. I mean, what are we doing here, Cash? What does this look like in a year?" He came into the room. Not far, just out of the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, turning it once around the brim, and she recognized that motion now. It was what he did when he was being careful. "My father wrote me a letter too," he said. "Gave it to Hatch to hold until after you arrived." He reached into his shirt pocket and held it out, not handing it to her, just showing her it existed. He said that the one thing he regretted was that he'd always understood what he had after he'd let it go. He said he hoped I was smarter than him. He looked at the hat in his hands. "I'm trying to be." Nora thought about her mother at 23, standing in front of this barn, smiling in that way. She thought about the word stillness written in small handwriting below a signature. She thought about how a person can spend a whole life not knowing what they carry from someone they never met. "I'm not easy," she said. "I walk the whole place in my head before I sleep. I'll reorganize every room in this house within 6 months, and I'll be right about all of it, and that will be annoying." "Probably," he said. "And I'm staying." He nodded. Slow. The way he did everything. "There's no shame in grieving 2 people at once," he said quietly. "Your mother, and the father you didn't get to know." He said it looking at the photograph, not at her. "You're allowed to carry both." She hadn't said anything about that. She had not asked for that specific kindness. It was the most precisely true thing anyone had said to her since the morning she'd sat in her mother's chair and opened a plain manila envelope. She sat down on the edge of the bed. After a moment, he sat in the chair by the window. The morning came in through the glass and lay across the floor between them in long pale bars, and they stayed like that for a while. Not saying anything, not needing to, 2 people from the same blood who had found each other through a dead man's love and a woman's careful handwriting and the plain fact that some things, left long enough in the care of time, eventually find their way to where they belong. She had walked into this room a stranger. She would walk out of it something else. The valley settled into its own verdict that autumn, the way a valley does, not through announcement or ceremony, but through the gradual, visible shift of what people believe to be true. Nora Calloway stayed at the Broken Horn Ranch. She took over operations management and, within the first full quarter, had reduced the ranch's operating costs by 11% through supply chain consolidation and a renegotiated feed contract that 3 other ranches in the county later asked to join. The county assessor, who had owed Renfrew a favor, quietly retired the following spring. Gerald Hatch told Nora, in their year-end meeting, that he had never seen a will executed with so little formal conflict for so much informal complexity, and she thanked him and drove home through the first snow of the season with the heater on and the mountains visible through the clear air like something promised and kept. Cash learned, over time, that she had been right about every room in the house. He did not say so in words. He said so by asking her once, in February, if she thought the storage situation in the tack room could be improved, and then building the shelving she described from memory, exactly as she'd pictured it, without asking her to draw it out. That was enough. The letters her mother had written are in a wooden pine box in the front room now, on a shelf between two books that both show their spine creases. Cash's father's letter to him is there too, in its envelope. Nobody put them there officially. They migrated, the way things do in a house that is becoming a home, each one finding the place it was meant to rest. Some evenings, when the light comes in low through the front window and catches the dust motes and the smell of dinner is in the air, Nora stops and looks at the box and thinks about all the miles a piece of paper can travel to find the person it was always meant for. She thinks about her mother at 23. She thinks about the word stillness, written below a signature in small, careful handwriting. She thinks, some things wait their whole lives for the right door to open. And then she goes back to whatever she was doing, because the evening is good, and the work is good, and the man in the next room is real, and the ranch outside is breathing in the dark like something that belongs to her now. Which it does, which it always was going to, from the moment a plain manila envelope landed sideways on a pile of unopened mail on a Tuesday in Kansas, and she sat down in her mother's chair and tore back the flap. Next week, I'll bring you the story of a woman who showed up to claim a dead stranger's debt, and found herself claiming something she'd stopped believing she deserved. It's a story about what we carry forward and what we finally set down. I'll see you there. Thank you for spending your evening here. I'm grateful for every one of you.